Welcome to this in-depth analysis of what is, honestly, one of the most baffling military mysteries of the entire 20th century. Today, we're unpacking the 1940 fall of France. You know, if you just look at the raw data, this conflict absolutely should have been a grueling, protracted stalemate, or maybe even an outright Allied victory. And yet, history tells a completely different story.
Okay, let's dive into this. How on earth did a massive global superpower like France, boasting a 5.5 million strong army and heavily armored tanks, just collapse in a mere 6 weeks? By mid-June, Adolf Hitler was literally taking tourist photos in front of the Eiffel Tower. It's this classic David and Goliath paradox, but with a massive twist. So, to figure out what really happened, we have to peel back the layers and look way past the surface-level myths.
Which brings us to Section 1, Victory on Paper.
Think about it. If you were a betting person in May 1940, looking at the spreadsheets, the odds overwhelmingly favored the Allies. Just look at this massive manpower gap. The French army had a colossal 5.5 million soldiers ready to go. On the flip side, the Germans brought 4.2 million troops. That is a massive 1.3 million soldier advantage for the French. That's literally the size of another country's entire military. But, as we're going to see, wars definitely aren't won just by having more boots on the ground.
And this brilliantly illustrates that the armored divide was just as stark. Out of the 4,204 total Allied tanks, France alone fielded 3,254 of them. Germany? Well, they only had 2,439. But here's the kicker. Roughly 1,500 of those German tanks were completely outdated Mark I and Mark II models. Plus, French tanks like the Char B1 and the Somme S-35 were significantly heavier and much better armored than anything the Germans had at the time. So on paper, France was heavily favored to win.
Let's move to Section 2, Defense versus Aggressive Mindset.
To really understand France in 1940, we have to look at the deep, lingering psychological trauma left by World War I. This trauma birthed an incredibly rigid, defensive philosophy symbolized by the Maginot Line. And we're not just talking about a wall here. It was a massive string of fortifications with entire underground cities, hospitals, and railways, all designed to protect their vital industrial coal and iron regions. It's helpful to think of the French military as the blue boxer. They completely believed in distributing their strength across their entire body just to absorb incoming blows. Because of this, they scattered their tanks in these little packets of 45 to 60 across the infantry, using them purely in a supporting defensive role. The Germans, on the other hand, are the red boxer. They believed in concentrating all their strength into a single, lethal offensive fist. They took their tanks and smashed them together into independent panzer divisions of 200 to 400 tanks. They weren't there to absorb a blow. They put absolutely everything into throwing a knockout punch.
Next up, Section 3, Flaws in Superior Tanks.
Now, what's really interesting about this is when we actually look at the hardware on the battlefield, we find fatal flaws hidden right inside those numerically superior French tanks. It just proves that heavier armor doesn't always equal a better weapon. See, the French used a one-man turret. Imagine you're driving on a chaotic, busy highway. In the French tank, the commander is essentially driving, navigating, answering texts, and checking the map all by himself, and while actively being shot at. He had to spot targets, load the heavy gun, aim and fire entirely alone. It's just too much. The German tanks, however, utilized a 5-man crew. Their commander only had to look out at the battlefield, spot threats, and make tactical decisions. He had a dedicated gunner, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator handling all the rest. The cognitive and physical overload on that solitary French commander severely hampered their combat effectiveness.
And that leads right into the German 3C system: command, control, and communications. Remember that rigid top-down defensive doctrine the French had? Well, because of it, French tanks rarely even used radios. They relied on field telephones, flags, or even literally sending couriers. They were essentially deaf and blind the moment they started moving. But the Germans? They put a radio in every single tank. This allowed them to communicate in real time, coordinate complex movements, and even call in artillery or Luftwaffe airstrikes on the move without ever having to stop. A real game changer.
All right, moving on to Section 4, Luck and a Dangerous Plan.
So stepping back to the big-picture strategic level, this highly predictable French strategy was on a collision course with an extreme, almost reckless German gamble. You know, people often think Blitzkrieg was this flawless, predestined masterstroke, but it was actually largely born out of sheer luck. Initially, the Germans had planned a super predictable World War I-style frontal assault. But in January 1940, a German plane literally crashed in Belgium, and the original invasion plans were captured. This massive blunder forced a complete rethink.
Now, General von Manstein had this wildly aggressive, risky plan that his superiors had actually already rejected. But by pure chance, one of Hitler's adjutants saw the plan, liked it, and bypassed the high command entirely to sneak it directly to Hitler over breakfast in February. And that, believe it or what, is exactly how the risky Ardennes thrust became the official plan for May 1940.
This new plan was an absolute gamble. Step 1. Launch a decoy attack into Belgium, just to draw the elite French 7th Army north. Step 2. Launch the main armored thrust straight through the incredibly dense Ardennes forest. The French commander-in-chief, Maurice Gamelin, felt completely confident leaving the Ardennes lightly defended. Why? Because he wrongly assumed it would take a modern army 15 to 20 days just to cross it. But the Germans, led by aggressive commanders like Guderian, planned to burst right through that forest and cross the Meuse River in just 4 days.
This brings us to Section 5, Terror and Psychological War.
The actual execution of this invasion was chaotic, to say the least, which brings us to the terrifying psychological aspects of this war. Before the physical defenses were even breached, French morale was just utterly shattered. When the German panzers inevitably got stuck in a massive 72-hour traffic jam in the Ardennes, a jam that French scout planes actually saw but High Command bizarrely completely ignored, the Germans called in the Luftwaffe. On May 13th, over 1,000 planes launched a relentless 8-hour rolling bombardment. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were equipped with what were called Jericho trumpets. These were mechanical sirens that emitted a blood-curdling, terrifying scream as the planes dove. The actual physical damage to the French defenses was relatively minimal, but the psychological terror it inflicted on the second-rate troop station there, it was absolutely devastating.
So, the crucial point is that this intense psychological warfare directly fueled what became known as the Panic of Bolson. At 4 p.m. on May 13th, a French artillery officer reported seeing German panzers rapidly approaching. This triggered absolute mass hysteria. Soldiers literally dropped their weapons and fled, with some running up to 100 kilometers away. But here is the truly wild part. The report was entirely false. It was a mass hallucination. There wasn't a single German tank across the river in that area yet. The entire Sedan defensive sector collapsed completely bloodlessly just due to sheer panic.
As the Germans poured through this massive, gaping hole, the contrasting command structures became glaringly obvious. The French command was incredibly rigid. Local officers couldn't react to anything without strict top-down approval, which meant they pretty much never seized the initiative. The German command, on the other hand, actively celebrated flexibility. Commanders like Guderian and Rommel frequently defied direct orders to stop. They just kept pushing forward on their own initiative, as long as they were completing their main objectives. In fact, when a French commander, a certain Charles de Gaulle, finally attempted a counterattack at Montcornet, it totally failed, mainly because he didn't have his own dedicated infantry or artillery to support his tanks.
Which leads us to our final section, the real truth of Blitzkrieg.
The lightning advance of the German forces pushed the Allies right to the brink, leading to the infamous encirclement at Dunkirk. And there, Hitler unexplainably issued a halt order on May 24th, inadvertently allowing the massive Allied evacuation. By June 14th, Paris, which had been declared an open city to avoid destruction, fell to the Germans. Finally, on June 22nd, a totally humiliated France signed an armistice inside the exact same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in World War I. We'll wrap up this explainer with a powerful quote from Napoleon: "I would any day prefer a lucky general over a competent one." It perfectly summarizes this whole event. We so often view the 1940 fall of France as a masterclass in invincible genius blitzkrieg tactics, but the reality? The German plan was initially just a World War I replica, and it only changed because of a random plane crash, a rogue adjutant, and a massive 72-hour traffic jam that the French simply ignored. The fate of the free world didn't just hinge on superior tactics or technology, it actually hinged on an incredible, almost unbelievable string of sheer luck. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. How much of history is shaped by pure genius, and how much is really just shaped by the roll of the dice?